Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, Jambo, Wadu, Bawani. Welcome to the Dark Diaspora African Renaissance channel. I'm your host, Ego, and it's a pleasure to have with me today Baruti Katembo, a tri-author, a co-author of Uwenzi. Here's his book, The Pan-African Factor, a 21st Century View, which is on sale now. Welcome. It's an interesting book, and I thought it would be good to reach out to you. And yeah, I'm glad you're here. So thank you for attending. And if you could please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to this conversation. As you mentioned, I am one of the authors of Uwenzi The Pan-African Factor, 21st Century View. Let me say there were two other authors who co-wrote the book, Kenneth Shockley and David Okombo. And the reason that I think this is interesting as we start our discussion on is because the book is tri-authored. So obviously this book is a testament to what can be the result of cooperation. In fact, that's what Uwenzi, the word that you mentioned as a Kiswahili word, that's what it means, cooperation. So we as three authors are coming from different backgrounds. My background is mathematics. The author, Okombo, his background is in ethnomusicology. And Shockley is a professor in urban education. And so we came together in different geographical parts of the United States to put a book together in which we had to communicate off and on by email, by Skype, by telephone. We had to give and take in terms of the assignments for writing different components of the book, trying to merge some of our ideas together. But it shows what can be done in the spirit of Pan-Africanism if we have the goal of trying to build consensus and trying to build cooperation to fulfill a particular goal. Sometimes I think that many people believe that Pan-Africanism, or the spirit of African people getting together, cooperating at the human level first, means that you have given up your individuality and differences. But to me, it doesn't mean that. It means that what you're trying to do is trying to find commonality toward achieving certain goals, toward building consensus, while you still maintain diversity. So people can have diverse views, have diverse cultures, but at the same time, they find strength in that which unites them. So I think this will be a good beginning for us to talk about common roots, core roots, and how we use the idea of commonality in building consensus to move forward in what we would define as Pan-African development, which will help us as a people and race the world over beyond where we are today, taking us in a more forward direction in the future. And that's on different economic, political, social, and cultural levels, multifaceted.
Thank you for that. And that's indeed what we're trying to achieve here. The future of Pan-Africanism. I see you have an echo. You have a page open here?
Do I have the page open?
Oh, any like YouTube page or something else?
Say that to me again.
It may not be me. Sorry, no, there's an echo when I speak. I'm just trying to figure out what it is.
Okay.
Okay. No, I think it's okay. You have a separate what's coming through the speaker down?
You want me to turn the speaker down?
Yes. Hello, hello.
Okay, right now it's at level 81. It's now at 75. You want to go lower than that?
Um, I'm just figuring. I'm trying to wonder why there's an echo. Um, okay, I'll just proceed because it doesn't seem like there's any way I can get it off. Okay.
I'll go down to 70.
Yes, a little bit, please.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, it's gone now. Thank
Okay.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So speaking about the future of Pan-Africanism, some people have viewed it or already condemned it and said it's dead, it's gone, it's diminished. Whereas some other people don't see it as a kind of unity of diversity or strength in diversity, and they've pronounced it dead and don't see any way forward because the definition apparently in a way keeps changing. It was obviously the everyone knows about the famous definition from Kwame Nkrumah, which is scientific socialism in his own kind of definition. I mean, what would you describe Pan Africanism as?
Well, let me just read a definition that we give in the Uwenzi book. Basically, we look at Pan-Africanism as optimizing the global linkage, networking, and appreciation of African peoples, resources, cultures, and interests. And we say this is Pan-Africanism. So basically, the heart of that definition deals with networking. But at the very basis of networking, we talk about social interaction. So if we're starting a conversation about Pan-Africanism to deal with an economic level, I think that's too far up on the food chain. I think that the basis is to link with other people on the human cultural level so that you learn to interact, and those people that you appreciate networking with, that you develop bonds, trust, camaraderie, then you learn to develop interactions and levels of trade and economics. Most people don't really want to spend time with others that they don't like or they don't understand. So creating an understanding at the human level and a respect for others then sets the basis in motion for the economic, and then from the economic we grow to a political. Let me say also that there's a point that I wanted to commend you on. I heard another show in which you were on, in which you, and hopefully I'm summarizing what my thoughts were that you said, basically that you had a critique of the policy structure of the AU right now, because you believe that the African Union primarily focuses its rhetoric on the economic integration of African countries, which is important, but you felt like they structured their conversation solely on that from the beginning without dealing with the policies that would encourage interaction of people between countries. And I think that's a key observation, because it's got to start at the soul level, SOUL first, so that we begin to build bridges. Right now, various news and media reports have said that Africa as a continent has the lowest percentage in comparison to the rest of the populated areas of the world in terms of trade. So Africa has 18% trade, which means that there's only 18% of commerce operating between nations on the continent, and there are 55 countries on the continent. That means that there's a low productivity internally. That means there's low communication over vast regions. And if we can improve the trade, we can reduce the costs of imports and of trading goods. That's the whole thing, to reduce the price of the goods, but also up the productivity of the trade amongst the nations. Well, before you can get to the trade amongst the nations, we've got to get to the goodwill between the various countries. So again, if we look at colonialism and what it was designed to do, where the so-called European powers, let's just take a few of them, France, Britain, Portugal, even Germany early on, but we'll leave them out for right now since those colonies were taken away from Germany during World War I. But let's look at the first three, be Portugal, France, and Britain, primarily dividing up much of the continent within their own economic zones, so that the territories that they were the colonial masters of would be hooked into their economies. So that even after colonialism was over on paper, from the mid-1960s up into the mid-1970s, for some countries, like, for example, Mozambique, not getting from under colonial rule until the mid-1970s. Still, even to this day, many countries in Africa are still connected to their former colonial masters, so that trade is exclusively done more so between those particular countries and their former colonial masters. So, for example, those countries in the Francophone zone, whether it be Togo, whether it be Benin, whether it be other countries, Cameroon, the French part of Cameroon, hooked into France, or whether it's, the colonial structures of Britain, Nigeria, Zambia, Malawi, they're still hooked into those particular countries, so that very little trade is done between different African countries who are under different colonial administration. I think that this needs to change for the sake of economic benefit for the continent. But as you have pointed out, and I think very rightly so, the only way those economic changes are really going to happen is if you begin to break down the barriers about why people in even adjacent countries feel isolated from each other, simply because various colonial languages were imposed upon those countries that are adjacent to one another. For example, Togo being French, Ghana being English, but both countries are adjacent to one another. Benin being French, Nigeria being English, those countries are adjacent to one another. Malawi being under British domination, while Mozambique being under Portuguese domination, but at the same time, those countries are adjacent. So it's like you have adjacent spaces with the same people historically, but they now see themselves differently in terms of even ethnicity, national origin, current culture, based upon the imposition of colonial domination. And so if we can break down the idea that we are separate because of the artificial barriers that have been placed upon us, then we'll increase the human interaction that will lead more toward the economic integration that everyone seeks. And I think that based on some of the dialogue that you and I have had, then we start getting back into what would be some of the strategies, concepts, ideas, and terms that would lead us back to sort of leapfrog over the colonial period, so we can sort of get back into a conversation about what are the core elements that bind us together as African people. that may be on language, that may be on common cultural ideas, that may be on even geography, but just a sense of self before colonization. And really a sense of self going way back before any of these countries had been thought of, whether they had been thought of by Europeans in the colonial period, or even thought of even 500 years ago, 600 years ago. But who are we as a race? So can we look at what would be what I would call our ethno-cultural identities way back when, to gets us into a conversation about what I would call our primordial selves?
Absolutely. And this I believe what led me to the designation of the proto ethno cultural and linguistic sources of our people, which comes from BaNtu, which are, I think it's been proven or shown to be from the Nigeria, Cameroon borderlands, or that regional area, which spread out over 5,000 years ago across the continent. And due to obviously wars and some slavery and disasters and fleeing and migrations over time, people developed different language structures and cultures in order to evade their captors. And this has now over time become emboldened as a cultural identity, misidentifying the origins of where each and every person came from, but now is being held on to so tightly and causing strife. But if someone like the African Union was to try to promote this, to promote the unifying factor amongst us all, it'll go a long way in helping to reintegrate the whole of Africa, rather than just building roads and bridges and focusing on economics. Because as you just rightly pointed out, neighboring states are aligned to their previous colonial rulers. And that hasn't really been changed much, especially with Francophone countries. So it's something I'm quite disappointed about, and would hope that it would be looked at. And I'm glad that you also share the same views. But I wanted to ask you a few questions. Like, okay, so what is your own take on BaNtu, especially from the language aspect? Because a lot of people, first of all, there's Kiswahili, which people believe was one of the proto-Bantu languages, and but some people say Swahili is an Arabic language. It originated from somewhere close to around, interactions in Zanzibar with Arabs, and that's what the language is. It's not an African language. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. Actually, Kiswahili is a Bantu language in both syntax and lexicon. Syntax being sentence structure, and lexicon in terms of vocabulary. Let me just try to clear up a few misconceptions, and I'm glad you brought that issue to the forefront. What we now know as Kiswahili, in terms of language content, existed before any Arab contact with African peoples on the east coast of Africa. By the way, when anybody talks about a language being Bantu language specifically, what they're talking about is languages that commonly have some variation of the word NTU, or the sound NTU, which means a person. So these languages have some variation of that syllable structure, meaning, or letter structure, that means a person. And that's how the languages are sort of grouped. They're similar in terms of, syntax structure, but they bear in mind a commonality about what it means to be a person or a human being. So that's how the languages are grouped. And there's anywhere from 1,000 or more of these languages on the continent. In fact, these languages of similar structure dominate the continent, the African continent's linguistic structure. Now, having said that, specifically with Kiswahili, basically what we know as Kiswahili emanates from the synthesis of dialects of a listing of people that's grouped together and identified as Mijikenda, Mijikenda, Mijikenda. And Mijikenda actually in Swahili, Miji actually means the villages. One village would in fact would be MJI, but MIJI is plural. So that means villages, towns, or communities. And Kenda is an older BaNtu word for 9. So when we put that together, it means the 9 villages. Now, these 9 villages or 9 communities are representative of various peoples who have communities that stretched from present day Somalia all the way down to and into Mozambique. This is about 1,000-mile stretch. So when Arab contact onto the East African coast for a lot of things, for trade, for acquisition of slaves and all kinds of interactions, the Arab called the languages collectively that they encountered as Sahil, Sahil, which in Arabic meant coast. So they were talking about the languages that they encountered along Africa's east coast were the coastal languages. But because Black people have not taken the time to master the narrative of our own history, then we've accepted a word from other peoples, or sort of like melded from other peoples about how they saw what languages we spoke, how they would frame it. Okay, so the term just kind of stuck about Kiswahili. Actually, Swahili just means the people who on the coast spoke whatever the language was, and then Ki means the language of those people. Okay, so what has happened in terms of the language itself, it really comes from the Mijikenda people, and I think that what we now know as Kiswahili should actually be changed to Mijikenda, because this is the origin of where the language emanates from. It doesn't come from Arabs. It comes from coastal Bantu peoples who had a synthesis of what we now know as the content of Kiswahili today. Now, let me say one other point on this. In all languages, the most dynamic of them are languages that borrow. So there are about 15% of vocabulary in Kiswahili that can be traced to an Arabic origin. However, the words have actually been what I would call Swahiliized or Bantuicized. As an example, a very common word for a teacher called walimu, Mwalimu. Actually, Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, was often referred to as walimu. And so the word walimu is exclusively, known as a Kiswahili word for a teacher. But in origin, the word actually comes from the word alim, A-L-I-M, in Arabic, which has to do with intellect or enlightenment. But the prefix, the MW, and the U on the end of it to be walimu is a Bantuization of the word alim. Okay, now, so you already have a language structure that already exists, but you have borrowed words into it. Now, for those people who think that, okay, this invalidates Kiswahili as being African or being Bantu, that's completely mistaken. But if we want to go down the road of basically putting synonyms, additional synonyms to replace any words in Kiswahili that have, any kind of Arabic origin, we can do that, because in fact, Swahili itself is an amalgamation of at least 15 different Bantu languages, not just the synthesis of Bantu dialects between the 9 communities that make up the Mijikenda people, but also additional Bantu languages that are in Central Africa and even in Southern Africa as well. So, for example, in Kiswahili, you have Kikongo language words. You have Kishona words from Southern Africa as well. So Kiswahili itself forms a language that is able to absorb dynamically words from various languages, which it has done. And it also acts as a resource for other African languages who may need a certain word and people want to know what they're saying, so they might have Swahili. I want to make one other statement, for example, just to show you how Swahili works. And one of the reasons that the language has spread so much is because Swahili has been used by all sorts of people. It's been used even by European colonialists as a general language in the colonial administration of various countries in Central Africa and East Africa, just because it was an easier language for people to deal with. And many people were familiar with the basic structure of the language because they spoke languages that were interconnected. And that's what we're talking about BaNtu. It doesn't mean that people who speak BaNtu languages just immediately understand all other BaNtu languages. What it means is that the rudiments of some of them are similar in vocabulary and in syntax, so that it's easier for people to eventually pick up the essence of the language once they began to interconnect with other people who are speaking languages of a similar structure. The best way I can probably talk about that would be, for example, when someone talks about the Romance languages, they're talking about languages that emanate from Rome. Now, what are those languages that emanate from Rome? The origin of the Romance languages is Latin, but the rest of the Romance languages that people know well are French, Romanian, even Portuguese. So those languages emanate from Latin. But if we took English today, English basically has a German syntax, but it's heavily influenced by a Latin base. Why is that? Because a lot of the Romance languages are very dominant in Europe, but at one time, ancient Britain was colonized by Rome. In fact, the main center of Rome's colonization of Britain was a place called Londarium. Notice the ending on that, I-U-M, and that was present day London. So therefore, when Britain broke away from Rome to establish even the different religions, such as the Anglican Church, prior to Britain's breakaway from to create the Anglican Church, Britain was under Roman occupation, a Catholic theological auspices, along with a language structure that was primarily Latin in origin. So again, the grouping and networking of certain kinds of languages, as I explained in terms of Romance languages, would be the same with BaNtu languages on a large basis, but you have so many of them now stretching across various geographical sections of the continent. As you talked about the spreading of the different African peoples who spoke BaNtu languages, who spread over the continent for various reasons that you alluded to, whether it be catastrophic weather conditions, fights and conflicts with other groups, searching for new land, for new food sources, new water sources, just movement about for exploration, eventually caused this the splintering of people from a core root. But again, I think that I would foster the notion that we should explore the term Kimijikenda, and that would really, I think, more properly give homage and respect to the origin of the language of being BaNtu and African, rather than perhaps continuing to use the words that Arab peoples use to describe the essence of the coastal languages that they came in contact with upon their entry onto the African soil via the East Coast.
Okay, speaking of Kimijikenda, where would this be in modern day, right now, where you said the nine kingdoms?
Yes, well, if you go to Google and look up Mijikenda, you'll see the 9 different ethnic groups that are listed who still live on the coastal area, and they range from people who are geographically living in present-day Somalia, coastal, Kenya, coastal, Tanzania, coastal, and down into Mozambique, coastal. So when we look at that long stretch, it's about 1,000-mile stretch. So that means that the 9 villages or communities spoke dialects that were very, very similar to one another. But if you were to combine the entire vocabulary of the 9, put that together, that's the amalgamation that creates the basic Kiswahili language. Okay, but because we have not been in control of the narrative about, touting the accomplishments of African people and using, our indigenous creativity to say this was us and somebody else shouldn't define us, the term has stuck as Swahili as a spinoff of the Arabic word Sahil. But again, this is because Arabs define the fact of they saw and interacted with people who spoke a language on the coast. That means that the language already existed in various dialectical forms, but they just simply coined it as the coastal languages. And what I'm saying is that causes confusion today intellectually with a number of our people who say, well, Swahili is an Arabic-based language, and that's not true at all. Let me give you an example of a loan word into English as an example. Everybody knows the term jumbo, right? In English, like jumbo jet or jumbo hot dog, mean big. But actually, the word jumbo is actually from a Kiswahili source, the word njumbe, which means a big person. So no one would ever make the claim that English, in fact, was simply an African language or an African-based language, simply because there were loan words of people who were English-speaking who had words from an African root. Even the word jazz, for example, is Mandinka, J-A-Z-Z. The origin of that is actually Mandinka for the music. Okay, but because we have not assumed our correct credit for developing language structures that are dynamic, then it's easy for other people to gain more credit and influence into something that they now become centered in, rather than the original creators of something that is dynamic. And what I want to do with the term Kimi Jakenda is to make a case that we should make sure that we document that which we have done, so that we operate on a more full and rich basis as we move forward. And this will also eliminate a lot of confusion about the origin of the language. So I hope that's a little summary of this. I know it's a large topic, but I hope that your listening audience will kind of get the gist of what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And speaking on the I guess appropriation of some of our contributions, I wanted to also touch on the curse of Ham theory that I think you also mentioned in the book. There was I believe it was an explorer, or the person who was the ideologist behind the curse of Ham theory, where Noah, son of Noah's son Ham, was cursed, and then he was blackened, and then all black people came from his progeny, and we were doomed and cursed to slavery from then, which is in the Bible. I think it's somewhere in Leviticus 21:18. So what did you feel you needed to add this in the book to clarify or demystify this myth and put to bed as a Bantu people being an original people from prior to even the Bible?
Yes, well, actually, that was actually put in a book to sort of deal with the cloud of white supremacy that African people or Bantu people have been under, as to the basis for the justification of slavery of Arab peoples and European peoples. As you have read the book, you will see that we talk about the Arab slavery of African people as really a precursor to European enslavement of African people. But because the Abrahamic faiths, which include Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, come from the same core, then these beliefs about the curse of African people being inferior, and that Caucasian people have a divine right to stand above the African, is the basis under which, or at least the major basis under which, African people were enslaved by Arabs and Europeans, with the participation of African people who were divided by language, by conflicts with neighboring groups. And these differences and divisions were taken advantage of in terms of one's hatred of one's brothers or sisters or adjacent ethnic groups that are living for the gain of others. And they would then justify the enslavement on a global basis based upon theological interpretations from books that justified white supremacy from their vantage point.
Okay. And so I know that was slightly digressing, but now that we're talking about the future of Pan-Africanism, we have an idea now of the origins of Bantu. We talked about how the origins are from obviously the Nigeria, Cameroon area region. Some have said, and I've read in some places, that there's another theory where it is also from the Namibia region. I don't know if you've come across that, or if you think there's any credence to that.
Yes, some people have theorized that Bantu may have started from the Namibia area and gone to the northeast, central, up west. Some people have theorized that Bantu may have started around what we now know as the Zambia area, and then sort of made its way north and central and west and southwest. But I think that, as language scientists have I think concluded that the click languages, are languages that obviously preceded Bantu. But if we look at the click languages and then we look at Bantu, we're talking about Bantu being words in the conventional sense that we know now. So perhaps Bantu languages came out of the click languages, because we know that the click speakers, what we now know as the cohesion peoples, and the Twa peoples were all over the continent. They just are not, they're only in small parts now, but we're all over the continent. So probably at first you had click languages that were over the vast portion of the continent, and then from the click languages, then you would get a morphing into others that would eventually become Bantu. And I think that when we start looking at languages in the southern part of the continent, Zulu and Swati and languages like that, we can find the clicks in those languages as well, as well. But I think on a conventional level, I think the Bantu-based type languages are the majority of languages that people on the continent speak in general. So in terms of what I would call recent ancient history, the Bantu languages tend to be the majority. And I think that because they are the majority now, I think that we can use that as a common base for interaction and discussion. Now, sometimes people think that look at Bantu as being simply a language category, but I would argue that for the utility of Pan-African development, that we should look at Bantu as being a ethno-cultural identifier just beyond people who supposedly spoke just a Bantu language, as in because Bantu means people or humans, then we can incorporate the entire African family into that discussion, even if someone makes the claim technically that someone doesn't speak a Bantu language. Now, when we get into Swahili being thought of, or I'm going to say Kimija Kenda, I'm going to forecast that, as being the foremost Pan-African language. I think as that language continues to be recognized by many people as being at least a source of cooperation, I think that we can kind of all go underneath the banner of Bantu, given that Kiswahili or Kimija Kenda are Bantu languages itself. And I think this has implications for not just the continent, but the diaspora. I would say the Bantu diaspora. As you and I have talked about previously, because of the slave trade and its massiveness, at least the Atlantic one, as well as the Indian Ocean one, perhaps we don't have time, perhaps in this show, to maybe get into that, but maybe at another time we can get fully into that. But the fact of the matter is that there are whole countries outside of the continent that are now predominantly Black and people of African ancestry and people who are Bantu. So in the United States, you have between 50 to 60 million Black people, just in the United States alone. That's a bigger population in terms of a definable group than most countries on the continent, bearing a few. There are very few countries on the continent that have between 50 to 60 million people who are Black. In Brazil, you've got at least 80 million African people. Okay, and then look at all the islands in the Caribbean that are predominantly Black. So when we start talking about Bantu, this needs to be an overarching term that's used to connect the vast diaspora as a resource and graft them back into a conversation with the continent. When I say a conversation, I don't just mean a verbal conversation, but I mean a participatory interaction where all of these different groups not only are able to use the continent as a resource, but the continent itself can be a resource for the diaspora. And when we have mutual resource sharing, mutual resource interaction, then we get that type of networking going that from what I had talked about as the definition of Pan-Africanism from the perspective of the Uwenzi book, the optimization of the global linkage, networking, and appreciation of African peoples, resources, cultures, and or interests. So for example, right now, you and I are having a conversation on two different continents. I'm in the Americas and you're on the European continent. I guess sometimes people in Britain claim they're not, I've heard a conversation once where some people say in Britain they're not Europeans, they're Atlanteans because they're off of the coast of Britain. But for sake of a simplistic discussion, Europe would be a continent. But the fact that you and I are communicating right now through a technology medium, we are in fact, as people in the diaspora, African diaspora right now, we are talking about the full participation of all of us, whether we're on the continent or in the diaspora, to benefit ourselves as African people, even though you and I are now talking across oceans. So this right here is a form of Pan-African development because we're starting at the level of conversation to build consensus, to build an exchange of ideas, to make our ideas public so that we then reach other people who might share like ideas, who can communicate with us, and we develop a whole body of thought. Then when we develop a whole body of thought, then we see where that thought goes. That thought may go into more extensive dialogue. It may go into more cooperation. It may get into networking and then eventually economic development. So as you said before to me one time, you said that you enjoy ideas. Ideas are not fruitless. Ideas begin the basis of mental thought that eventually turns into substantive action. I think this is where it starts. And your conversation with me, even though we've never met physically, but we're communicating verbally, audio-visually, is the start of building relationships that can lead to other things in a more positive and progressive way.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's amazing the times we're living in. I mean, in this 21st century, I think it'll be one that'll be very defining as long as we get to shape it and frame the conversation early on and get people involved, which is what we're trying to do. What comes to my mind is the length of, or the extent of, the division that all this has caused, and the forgetting, or the lack of knowledge of understanding of who we were. Like, something can happen in Africa, in the United States, to an African American, whereby if everyone saw themselves as Bantu, if there was a shooting or killing of someone there, the whole continent would be up in arms. They would feel this is one of their own people, and revolt, stand up, take to the streets, be angry about it, urge their governments to take action. Whereas now they see themselves as different. Likewise, if in Africa you hear when some people are being taken up into Libya for slavery, some people in the United States might not see that as one of their own people. And same goes for Brazil. In South America, we see people living in the slums there, in the Bahias, and going through a terrible ordeal. But people are largely uninformed, or have no interest in it. So it's seeing ourselves a different way. And I just kept thinking that there should be one entity, one body of thought, as you said, that could bring everyone to believe and to see that they are one people. I think you mentioned something about a term, diaspora Bantu. I had a thought about that, and do you think, or don't you think, it would cause a kind of second-tier peoples on the continent, whereas people on the continent would be called Bantu and they'd be called diaspora Bantu? I just had that thought that perhaps that would be a kind of issue.
Oh, you mean rather than just saying Bantu, period?
Yeah.
I didn't mean diaspora Bantu really to really emphasize complete distinction. I simply meant diaspora Bantu just to denote Bantu peoples who are not physically living on the African continent. But in this regard, if one said continental Bantu and diaspora Bantu, because Bantu then is used as a noun, that's the commonality. The continental or diaspora is simply an adjective to modify the same word. So in that regard, I was just speaking geographically, but that we're all Bantu peoples because we're recognizing that we are of the same source. By the way, you have made me think of something when you said that we see each other as different, and we have, and the whole goal of course, white supremacy, domination, and the splintering of us is to get us to see each other differently so that resources and manipulation of us can be more easily done. All right, now having said that, I want to use an opposite concept to hold up a mirror to us to see how what you said about Pan-Africanism or Pan-Bantuism, if you want to use such a term, how that's not happening, but how it should be happening. As you have probably read in the news right now, that many of the whites in South Africa are concerned as to whether the farmland will be confiscated from them, supposedly without compensation.
Yes.
And right now, the members of the Australian Parliament, Australian government, are already working to try to reach out to the white South African farmers to provide them with a fast track to citizenship to come to Australia if they all of a sudden become landless. Actually, this might be extended beyond just the farmers, but to the European citizens in general in South Africa. Now, this is very interesting. By the way, and a petition is also being circulated in the United States to the same effect, to ask the current government of the United States to bring the white farmers and perhaps white citizens of South Africa to the United States if things get hot for them in South Africa. But now listen at the fact that these people in Australia are separated by oceans away from South Africa, the Australian and the South African. But they all have a colonial history. But it didn't take the Australian government long to recognize their kith and kin of primarily English descent, of their kith and kin in South Africa. And they reached out to them to give them a new homeland of which to live. That's because wherever the European peoples, in this particular case, the people who are of British descendancy, whether it be in the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the British diaspora group, they recognize their kith and kin over long distances, separated by oceans, time, and perhaps to some degree, culture. But they recognize their kith and kin over long distances and are willing to cooperate and see themselves as themselves in times of need. Do we reach out to each other in terms of the African diaspora? Has there been any help coming from the African continent to the cries of African American people in the United States? No, because we might see ourselves as completely different. As you say, things can happen to various African people across the globe, and nothing is said by other African groups because we don't recognize each other as being really the same people that may be separated by time and distance, but people who really share the same ancestry and kinship by and by. And therefore, this campaign that we're talking about the term BaNtu, Pan-Africanism, even the use of Kiswahili or Kimija Kenda are intertwined in terms of building consensus, building at least the idea of shaking hands across oceans and land.
Yes, that's an excellent analogy. I actually it didn't cross my mind with you of South Africa and Australia. That didn't cross my mind, but that's a perfect example. I mean, something that I was quite disappointed with, which was Haiti wanting to join the African Union, but was rejected, or the call wasn't heeded. That was quite disappointing. I'm still unclear as to what the facts are. I know they had observer status at the African Union for a long time, but it's things like this that make me feel the African Union has been hijacked, and its policy or its mandate is no longer towards or for the African people. I keep seeing different instances where they could prove their worth and their mandate and work for the African people, but at each and every time, I keep seeing a kind of obfuscation and diversion from the point, from the fact. I mean, there's no reason why Haiti shouldn't be allowed to join the African Union. Absolutely no reason.
Right.
It might be just leadership, but leadership of over 50 countries. All 50 leaders wouldn't want to do that. I mean, it's quite surprising. I really can't understand it, except it's a wholesale kind of conspiracy. This is what comes to mind. But anyway, for that, I want to talk about a resource allocation. Excuse me. So in this kind of vision of a future of Pan-Africanism, where it has a kind of BaNtu kind of setting, and everyone say has settled on a BaNtu identity, and we are now working in communication and solidarity with one another. How do you think resource dissemination and allocation should work in the country when it comes to hard minerals or power or energy or mining or resource? I mean, how do you think it could work?
Well, on that aspect, I think I have heard you give some visions about how do you think geopolitically countries would work. I think I have not given as much thought to the geopolitical end. In fact, I would like to hear your breakdown of that regard. Once people understood that they had a common core, perhaps we would have a new functionality about how resources are exchanged, between countries. The only thing I'd say right now is that if we did recognize a common core, we would seek to trade with one another across adjacent countries and across regions. Now, the framework of that, I don't have hard and fast views about how it would work. Perhaps you could throw out some ideas on that right now, because I think you had given some additional thought to the political framework that would happen. Because I think what you're talking about is you're not just talking about, do the countries have resources to trade? We know that they do, but I think you're talking about how the framework would operate of trading once people realize they do have a common core and were eager to cooperate with their neighbor. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. So
okay.
I'll go into it. Like the vision I have is currently now there's obviously it's even worse. First of all, you have to function within the country's framework, and not only the country's framework, now within the regional framework. So Nigeria being in the ECOWAS Union, but Cameroon right next door, they can't trade with them. Literally right next door neighbors, they cannot trade with them because they're not in West Africa. And that goes for even on the other side with East African Community or SADC South. They literally don't trade. I know they've introduced the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which means now trade can just work in all parts of Africa. But I feel the way, again, that is constructed, it's not constructed with the people in mind. It's constructed with making business easier for Western powers, for foreign entities to work freely and move their goods around the continent easily and freely. Because if it was done with the actual constituents in mind, then there would be the social, cultural integration. There would be the language being taught in different schools. So in West Africa, they'd be taught Kiswahili. In East Africa, they'd be taught Yoruba or Robo. In South Africa, they'll be taught Twi, and you just have these options to be able to let people grow into the knowledge of themselves. And then further on, when you want to now start having trade, it would be more of a case of a culture, say like the Twi people or the Iwe people in Togo, say for instance, they have a resource in the land that they have. Say they have columbite, and the Luo people in Kenya need columbite, but they have, say, bananas, and then the Iwe people want bananas. So they just trade, just those two. It might end up being municipalities or mini ethnic states or nations, as you may call it, and they just trade without having to go through, basically bypassing government and and the country border structure to just trade very freely. It'd be almost like micro-state trading. And there's precedence for this because, you know, there are many, many small states. Liechtenstein, who's 36,000, I think, in Europe. Switzerland, only just a couple of millions. The smaller states like Malta and all these other places, and they have a freedom to set their own interest rates. They have a freedom to set whatever business rates that they want to invite investors to come in. Whereas if it goes with the state, they have to set an interest rate countrywide for various reasons according to the different people they're trying to cater for. So I just think it has to be more on a micro level and more dynamic, more free. And the same comes to what I think I heard you say about resource when it comes to generation of power. If a state is closer to the sea, they have wind power, but they need to trade with someone else who might only who have solar power, who's more in the interior, and they can exchange things that way. So it'd be almost like a kind of crucible of different engineered parts working in unison.
Mm-hmm. Well, the United States, in a way, comes to mind. I kind of look at the United States as being a geopolitical entity with 50 pseudo-sovereigns underneath it. So, for example, Florida and Georgia might have various trade agreements, but they are still states within the United States. So it seems like what you're saying is that you have overarching trade agreements between countries, but then you have the ability for smaller entities within countries to trade across borders and to trade across regions, which will in fact probably open up the ability for more free trade, probably more interaction that occurs. So, I mean, I think that we can look at models that currently do that and apply it appropriately to African states. But now I think that what would have to happen would be that as people saw themselves similarly, there will be more of an outreach to do that. I think that what you're talking about is having multiple trading entities happening at one time between the states, between perhaps different ethnicities, and between different businesses that are in different countries, being able to cross trade between countries and within regions. Am I grasping that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but in order to put that kind of in place, I think we would have to get people to see the need for them to reach out in an adjacent way or in a regional way. Right now, I think people, even in adjacent countries in Africa, may not see themselves as the same as another country next door. And those barriers set in place by colonialism and other factors help keep the separateness and therefore minimizes the urge to want to trade. And I think we got to break those barriers down as we move toward what you're talking about. I see what you're talking about as a later stage in the development of interaction. Right now, we probably just need the social interaction first and foremost, so that we want to be a part of participating in the life and positive direction of our neighbor.
Absolutely. I mean, what else would be better than having a kind of nervous system where you are having trade agreements with 600 entities on a local level? which means you on that local level have to learn about those 600 entities at one time and keep and maintain those relationships. Whereas now that we're on a country level, even though somewhere like Nigeria has 400 cultures on a country level, they don't know anything about people from Cameroon. Still, they just have no knowledge of them or of the people or their languages or even interaction. They don't even travel to those countries right next to each other. So it's been a complete failure.
Why is it, for example, say with Cameroon, if you look at the news right now, Cameroon seems to be splintering between the Anglophone and Francophone sections of Cameroon about power struggles when it comes to their populations defined by language. But for at least
you don't know about that because there's a part of that history that I think people sometimes don't recognize. Nigeria and Cameroon, and North and Southern Cameroon were once together. So I think during when the German colonizers, I think he gave it up and were leaving, I think, then it splintered off. And then there was a referendum. I think they had to decide if they wanted to go with Nigeria or Cameroon. And people in the Southern Cameroon, they went with Cameroon, but they were English speaking always. So it was part of Nigeria at some point. And then now they feel like they've been marginalized because everything has to be done in French and powers in the north of the country, and they've had no representation. So now they want to secede. But it was a choice that they made initially to actually join with them, whereas it possibly shouldn't have been the case. And in any case, I think the breakdown of all those barriers into more of a wider federation, which should take care of that particular issue.
Well, I guess I had a question also. I'm glad you brought that point up. I have a question. Why is it that you feel that people from Nigeria, why don't they know much about people from Cameroon? And why don't a lot of people from Nigeria travel to Cameroon, even if we wanted to look at the English-speaking section of Cameroon versus the Nigerian area, which would be English-speaking? Why is there little contact even between what I would call Nigeria and Anglophone Cameroon?
Well, a number of things. I think after independence, most countries had a short-lived period of democracy, and they were quickly usurped by military dictatorships, which lasted about 30 years, which was just a period of complete mismanagement. The airlines that they had all fell to complete disrepair. And then the only flights you would have would be ones facing outwards. There weren't any flights going in between. As you can imagine, with dictators, they all clamped down on a lot of their countries, airways, airspace, and just complete control and domination of everything that was happening. So people were more leaving the continent than traveling in and around the continent. There was a large brain drain at that point where people went to the US, Germany, and then UK, and other parts of Europe at that stage. So it was a dire time, not a time where people were making holidays, and definitely not going to other African countries because there was no development going on. And then due to the bodies of the entities, I think ECOWAS was created, fully formed in 1975. So since then, it's just been, okay, we are a bloc. I'm only talking about ECOWAS now. We are a bloc, and they just faced that bloc. And I guess that's the way everyone just looked. Everyone just turned away from each other and never really thought or had the foresight to think of Pan-Africanism. I think that's the main thing. People just saw a lot of suffering and unrest in many countries that making it a holiday destination wasn't to the forefront of anyone's mind, I don't believe. That's very
Okay,
good.
so one of the things that would have to happen, I think, to alleviate the scenario you just brought up, or the events you just brought up, we would have to have in schools in the United States where Black people are, schools in the Caribbean, and in parts of curriculum access in countries on the continent about each other. That there's probably no formal ways in which people know how to reach out to one another, where we read about each other and we can interact with one another. So at the local levels, that would have to be part of the mix. School children, as an example, in Nigeria, would have to be able to interconnect with school children in Cameroon.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I see in the United States that should be done is you have at least 100 historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. And I think it's incumbent upon them to work with governments and universities on the African continent to be able to cross-share information about one another from different countries, so that we don't get a balanced and a rich view of each other without it being clouded by negatives, which negatively affect the interaction. And I think that even at the academic level, there should be outreach. I mean, if you and I can communicate by video conference like we're doing now, these kind of initiatives with minimal funds can be erected on a larger scale between institutions, so that we learn more about each other. And when people learn more about each other, then there's probably a more likely scenario in which they want to reach out for trade, for conversation, for socialization. And I think those things have to take place in order for economic integration on a macro scale to happen between governments. And I think that was some of your point, that the AU is trying to present a top-down situation of, at the macro level of economic integration, without looking at the local level, that people need to interact, people need to develop communication before we can get something on the macro level to happen. Am I correct in that assessment of your views?
Absolutely. It's the chicken before the egg scenario that I keep talking about, because you're saying you want to create free trade zones and build roads and bridges and highways and train tracks, but people have never come across each other before. For almost 5 decades, have never traded with each other, speak completely different languages. It would make sense that to get ready for people to interact, that's what you'd focus on an understanding of themselves and each other, and be teaching that in schools almost 20 years before you launch this project. But it's been completely ignored, and they're expecting people to just come together and make it happen. It just doesn't make sense, because sometimes the relationships define the kind of businesses they would do, defines the way they want to interact, defines the level and the depth at which they will collaborate. Sometimes the relationship, like I use England, Europe for an example. English and French have a very strong collaborative relationship. More so than I would say with the Dutch, and definitely more so than the Germans. Obviously, there's a history there and relationship, but in general, they always stand in cordial relationship with each other over time. But if you just want to throw them in, I don't know, say with Estonia now, and it's supposed to have a kind of treaty with Estonia, they're going to have to take time to sit at the table and really work out what it is they're both about and what they both stand for before they come to some kind of agreement. But I've never met a Luo person in my life. Nor have I met someone from a Khoisan person. You know, and this is very sad. And if we were to meet, I probably wouldn't even know. I wouldn't be able to recognize them. Whereas when you start having regular interactions, you can just tell about a person. The depth of the relationship is much more stronger, and it leads to better business relationships as well.
Well, actually, it's interesting that you are bringing up the fact that different ethnic groups of African or Bantu peoples have not met one another. Let me mention that, you know, it's highly probable that in the areas of the diaspora, whether it be, let's say specifically the UK and the United States, that there's, and Canada, that there's probably more interaction between different ethnic groups or national ethnic groups of African peoples in those spaces on a general basis than it is between those national ethnic groups of people on the African continent. And having said that, if you agree with that sentiment, why do you agree? And have you seen the scenario that I'm talking about in the UK, and why is that?
Yes, I do agree with that sentiment. It's almost like a melting pot over here. You have you come across people from all parts of Africa here. I've met someone from Zambia. I've met someone from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and you interact with quite a lot at the same time, and you don't feel different. You feel more, I guess, because there's a shared value or shared experience here. Here in the West, you're perceived as Black, and then right. We all fall under that umbrella, and there's a camaraderie there where we tend to not, it doesn't get brought up or to the surface our differences, because we all speak English, any differences or slight cultural nuances that may exist. We just see ourselves under the umbrella of Black. So that forges a kind of Pan-Africanism that I think is stronger than it would be on the continent.
Well, this is why the different African diasporas, plural, should be used as a beacon to the African continent about what Pan-Africanism is all about. Perhaps we will have to be a model in some ways to communicate what Pan-Africanism is about on the soul level that is missing on the continent. And this is why I like the idea of interaction and connecting. Just like what you and I are doing, just like what I told you that we had done with the Uwenzi book. By the way, one of the authors for the Uwenzi book, he's originally from Kenya. So just in that kind of interaction, it is Pan-African and inter-ethnic at the same time. And I don't think that the diasporas, the African diasporas, have been utilized as much as possible in the growth, development, and progress of the continent. And that's what I would like to see. I would like to see a mutual resource. I would like to see the African diasporas use Africa as a resource, and I want the continent to be able to use us in the diaspora or in the diasporas as a resource for the continent. We need mutual resource sharing and resource building. And therefore, we can come up with an interconnectedness that is based on Pan-Africanism, cooperation, though we will have diversity. And I want to stress that Pan-Africanism does not negate diversity. It only enhances sharing so that diversity can be a strength in an optimized cooperation and consensus building effort.
Okay, I want to delve into that a little bit. When you say using each other as resource, what do you mean by that?
Okay, what I mean as a resource would be, say, for example, let me use an African American / continent scenario. I think that one of the major initiatives that would help the African American population would be for African Americans to have dual citizenship in one or a few countries on the African continent. Now, this doesn't mean that all the African American people would just immediately leave the United States and move to whatever participating African country it is. Mm-hmm. Say, for example, we just pick a country. I'm just pick Zambia, for example.
Okay.
Let's say that Zambia opened up dual citizenship to interested African American people. It might have some African American people who may leave to move to Zambia, but a lot of people would just simply stay where they are. Now, suppose that you have copper mining, which is the case in Zambia, but you might have some Zambian companies who are part of the copper mining, but they may also interlink with some African American companies who would be citizens of Zambia also, who are working in the United States. So you might have people investing in the United States into Zambian copper mines who are based in the United States. It could be tax companies or accounting firms that are working with one another. It could be educational institutions. So therefore, they're using expertise as resources for each other. So that means that for African American people, that may mean import-export of goods into the United States from Zambia. That may mean cross-reference revenue sharing. That may mean investment. So it doesn't mean that everyone would have to live in the same country. They just have mutual love for having a second home somewhere. For example, most of people who are Jewish in the world do not live in Israel, but they just look at Israel as their homeland and they interconnect with Israel, the country, regardless of whether they're Jewish people who live in Holland, Britain, the United States, Australia, or other parts of the EU. So this is in a nutshell what I mean by utilization of resources. Human resources, by the way, are also a resource. Let me throw that out. So a lot of times people talk about resources as being like mineral resources or, hard resources, but human resources, intellectual capital is also a resource.
Yeah, I think that's one that's highly underutilized. The amount of expertise in the diaspora, and as you said, when we talk about Africa, we need to include Brazil, Caribbean, in America, in Europe, and some in Asia now as well. So we're well over 1 billion people. But with that spread of people and spread of acquisition of various experiences and expertise around the world, we pretty much have everything we need. and just need to pool it in a very effective way that whoever needs it at any point or part in the homeland gets it and gets the development, gets the exchange, be able to help their sources out there as well, bring them back. Like I feel there needs to be a drive. As there was a brain drain, there needs to be a brain gain. There needs to be a drive to try and get these experts, intellectuals, engineers, doctors, and get them all back. Start off with them, give them citizenships first of all, have them have that second home or option to come into this federation, and then come in and start to work and help build wherever the help is needed, and focus on those key points.
Let me throw this out at you for just a second. The case in Zimbabwe where the land was taken from the white farmers, you know, to give back to you know, African people, though some of that turned out to be a debacle, but nevertheless, there was thought that there will be a drop off in the service of what the farms would mean economically to the country, because the white people were in control of the commercial farms, and then suddenly they were not anymore. Well, actually, Zimbabwe could have actually reached out to African American commercial farmers and cut them in for deals. Like, for example, dual citizenship in Zimbabwe, parts of their salary could have been, you know, investment or shares in some of the diamond and gold mines in Zimbabwe, emerald mines, etc. They could have sweetened the pie for that. But African American farmers could have gone to Zimbabwe for training indigenous people and for making sure there was no technology or production drop off in the running of those farms. But however, I want to show you conversely, since that was not done, and it appeared as though you know, the white farmers had such a bargaining chip as a massive resource, some of the farms are being given back. Okay, but now in Australia, they already are talking about the fact that of the Euro South Africans will be valued in Australia. Now, as you well know, Australia has been actually importing for citizenship numbers of people from East India to Australia for IT and for software engineer positions. Okay, but already there are numbers of conversations happening in Australia where they're looking at the white South African population as being a valuable resource for Australia in terms of all kinds of skills, that if they were to import white South Africans into Australia, that Australia itself would shore up all of the deficit areas that they're not able to fill in terms of population of people in all sectors of their society, whether everything from IT to agriculture. So utilizing the white South Africans as resources for Australia is something that they're already thinking about. When the situation was that obvious in Zimbabwe, but was not acted upon in the scenario where I mentioned that you know, African American farmers could have been brought to Zimbabwe and cut in for dual citizenship and shares in some of the diamond and gold mines in Zimbabwe. That could have been a very doable deal. And the fact that our people don't think about such things because Pan-Africanism hasn't been promoted on a practical level, because we don't reach out, we don't connect at the soul or human level, as you have suggested, then we don't think about the little things that build relationships to eventually cause congruency economically and in other matters of engagement.
I know, man. It's just it just beats me. I keep going back to the African Union because the African Union clearly states in their mandate their purpose is to try to unite all peoples, to look out for the dignity of the black man, to encourage cross relationships, unification of peoples, spread prosperity. They make all these claims on their website. But then when you look at the actual, structures they put in place and what they're trying to achieve, it's not there. It's actually not there. I just see projects that require China to come and build bridges or some other companies and then open up the country for external businesses. But as you just rightly pointed out, there were Black American farmers who I'm sure have large mechanized farms that would have come over, traded, gotten shares, had a mutual kind of exchange. And then that would leave a legacy where probably their children's children will continue to do it and work with the farmers and train them up eventually. And it's a win-win. That brings a relationship together and allows people to now bond over time and make them start to see themselves as part of Africa. But there is no drive for this. It's quite frustrating. But
by the way, on top of that, we have a number of historically Black colleges, as I said before, in the United States. A number of them are geared toward engineering and agricultural research. This is a major resource that can be used in the continent's development. In fact, the infrastructure that African American people have is a tremendous resource for the continent. A tremendous resource. For example, let me ask you, how many universities are in Nigeria?
Well, there's a lot of private ones popping up every now and then. But if I think of them, there's University of Ibadan, Bafemi Awolowo University, University of Nigeria, University of Lagos. I think I'm thinking the federal ones now. I'd say
got 100.
Oh, I think less than that.
Wait a minute. You're telling me in Nigeria, a country of 196 million people, if I'm not mistaken, that has less than 100 colleges and universities. But
not colleges, but federal universities. I think less than 100. Any notable?
Okay.
Yeah.
But in the United States, there are 100 historically Black colleges and universities. So, given what we even have in the U.S., that's being underutilized. That's being underutilized in Africa's development. There are plenty of researchers that are Black African people in the United States that should be given an opportunity through linkages, through shared cooperative initiatives to help participate in the life and growth of the continent. One of the things is that that we have not defined the broad spectrum of Africanists. And I think that's what we're trying to get to regarding our concept about BaNtu. By the way, let me just say this before I forget, for your listening audience or so, I'm sure that, as you've heard detractors who talk about why they don't think that Kiswahili is African, hopefully we have given some discussion tonight to debunk those fallacies. But also, I'm sure that there are other detractors who will talk about the word BaNtu and say that the word Bantu is just a Eurocentric creation. And I want to just mention that for a minute. I want to raise the name of a person by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Bleek. Dr. Wilhelm Bleek, or Wilhelm Bleek, he was a German linguist of the 19th century, and he spent a number of time in Southern Africa particularly, and he used the term Bantu in a collective way, and sometimes people have erroneously called him the father of Bantuism. Yeah. And then some people will say, well, you know, here was this European person who just made up this term Bantu. No, not true at all. We're talking about some form of the word Bantu, meaning human beings, that already exists in the 1,000 Bantu languages that I mentioned before. He just simply reminded us, let me put it that way, about the close connection of the languages, typified by the use of some form of the word NTU, or Bantu in the languages. But the words in the languages that related to a human being or a person were already there. He just simply reminded us that it was already there. So I wanted to just throw that out just in case there are detractors who might even criticize the use of the word Bantu as simply being a European creation. That's not true at all. And I wanted to just debunk that on the show.
Yeah, thanks again. There are quite a few detractors who would like to use that as an Arabic view, or it's a, I've heard before, it's a German linguist view, but it's good to know that it's an original, intact classification of peoples and language, undisputed by any other external forces.
Let me throw one thing out to you. Let me ask you a question, and I want to just make a comment on something. Okay. Have you heard of the term Ubuntu?
Yes.
Okay. What comes to mind when you hear the term Ubuntu?
I had this conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and he gave a very elaborate description, but he said it's hard to put in words. It's a kind of, the phrase he said, it said to him, and from how he grew up knowing what Ubuntu meant, it meant I am because you are, or something like that is the way he described it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I am because you are, I am because we are, is a context that we are able to exude our humanity based upon our interconnection with others. Sometimes it means humanity, sometimes it means human kindness, sometimes it means that we know more about our feelings based upon the context of our interaction with other people. Now, I want to break down the word just for a second. We know the word Ubuntu is coming linguistically from the Nguni languages, Nguni languages, which is a smaller subset of Bantu languages, which are used to house the grouping of languages like, Ndebele, isiZulu, Siswati, and a number of other tongues, particularly in Southern Africa. But if you were to take off the U as the first letter of Ubuntu, you just get Buntu, which is really a derivation of the word Bantu. Now check this. Bantu means people, and various forms of Bantu, whether it's MTU, MTU, by the way, is a name for a person in Swahili. But you have other languages that may have a base of NTU. But anyway, some form of Mtu whether it be BaNtu or Abantu or various kinds of structures, if you look at the core of Ubuntu, it comes from a nucleus of the word Bantu, meaning people. In Swahili, for example, when you put a U sometimes on the front end of a word, it simply means to create the worldview, the space, or the scenario surrounding that which already is. So by putting the U in front of Ubuntu, you're talking about the circumstances or the essence of being a person. And when you start talking like that, then that means humanity. So again, even the word Ubuntu has its origins in the word Bantu, having to do with a human, having to do with a person, and the circumstances of being a human is to exude your humanity based upon that which you are. You stand on the shoulders of what others are. I am because we are. So therefore, we can connect all of these concepts, Bantu to Ubuntu, to be able to philosophically understand the ethno-cultural essence and core of who we are as a race of people on this planet. And I like to break that down to people because all of these things are intersectional and they relate, whether it be the concept of Pan-African language, who we are ethno-culturally, what we share in common, ideas about our worldview, the exchange of resources, the ability to communicate over different geographical areas. I think we have to go to a simpler idea to start off in your vision, to be able to communicate at the human level as a spinoff to these other layers, whether it be economic and political. And I do agree with you that the missing component or the missing thrust regarding the AU of not pushing, the human interaction, I think is a misstep. And I agree with you that that needs to be challenged and rechanneled.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in thinking about it, I reached out to someone working for the African Union, whose role I think in a particular department was to try and figure out or realize what strategies to use to employ to reach this. And I think we've just gotten a response, and hopefully he will be on the show soon. And when he does, I'll definitely let you know and see what his view is on our conversations as well, coming from that. But okay, thank you for that. Just to wrap up, I wanted to speak on one other thing, on education. So you just mentioned there are about 100 universities, black colleges and universities in the U.S. I didn't even know there were that many. That's quite surprising. Do you know of any exchange programs, information exchange or knowledge exchange between Africa and those African Americans in those universities? Is there any kind of programs that goes on? Or
There are probably some, but they're probably sparse. It's like they're not quite developed in terms of the engines of those schools being used as a resource for participation in the growth of, African countries. It's just, sometimes it's done, but I don't think that it's being optimized. And I would like to see those things optimized. I think that where we could start would be to have intense, full, and rich historical programs, cultural interaction programs between African American peoples and these different countries. We need to know about each other's histories. through our own lenses, not narrated through other people. It's got to start on the small level that you're talking about of the human, interaction.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it could be done. As we said, I'm speaking to you right now. You're in the United States. I'm here in the UK, and we're doing some of this right now. So why this can't be done as well? Because if the excuse would be geography or resource or flights or any kind of other expense, I mean, all you need is a computer and a camera, and you can have regular seminars and interactions and communications over a long space of time, year in, year out.
Right. It can be done. But again, people think of resources sometimes as, things that are expensive. They think about everything dealing with cost. But really, if the goal is to get people to talk, then that doesn't have to be expensive. We take one step at a time. Sometimes people are thinking on a macro level when we need to think on a more simplified micro level. Again, and again, a point that you made, and maybe you can expand on this and we can expand upon this in the future between ourselves or other people that would like to participate. I think that human resources go underutilized. Sometimes people think that if it doesn't involve, great amounts of money or physical entities, then that's not really a viable resource that can amount to anything. But I think human resources has got to play a major role in how we start the interaction off. What do you think of that? And can you expand upon that a little bit?
I do agree with that. I mean, it's just like knowledge exchange. So if there's a particular skill that isn't available on the continent, rather than trying to look for or hold back the exploration of that skill or resource through saying, okay, I don't have the money to send someone overseas to get training, to get that resource. All you have to do is you can have something like a training kind of module where someone, say, like myself over here, whatever skill and profession I have, I can provide that training, my vocation, my time. And a lot of people want to do it willingly, to just have a screen up. You can have the person you're training, teaching the skill, providing a little lecture, and showing them how to do things. I mean, it can be done that way. That way we're passing off information and skills and training and exchanging those vital components as soft resources.
Right. I agree completely. In fact, that's probably a very good idea that, even video conferencing, perhaps module training, electronically or e-training, let's say, can be, an economically efficient way of not only utilizing resources, but also of skill and technology transfer. And I think we should explore that. But just the idea of going down that road of interaction, you've got to start with the idea that people want to interact. And once they want to interact, then we'll find ways to do it. But I guess the will to want to interact has been, it's been under some kind of blockage.
There's a brainwashing, I think, that's occurred over time, where people would rather focus on other things, focus on religion, focus on think corrupt practices, because they don't feel that there's any other way they can achieve their goal, or focus on nepotism to get into positions of benefit. But there are many ways. I mean, it's education, for instance. I'm thinking there has to be a lot of radical changes. I mean, Nigeria has the largest amount of children out of school right now, about 10 to 11 million kids out of school right now. Like that's almost if it's 190 million people, so that's just over close, I don't know, 8% or something like that. It's almost 10%. That's a large number of kids out of school.
Well, I thought it was. I thought Nigeria had around 196 million.
Well,
is that inflated?
I think it's inflated. I mean, what's been bandied about for a while has been, well, the last census I think was probably a few years ago, and back then it was 180. So could it be 196 now? Possibly. Possibly it could be. But the point is that there are a lot of kids out of school, and if it's the funding that's not being provided for schooling, for education, for teachers, then they have to think of more resource savvy ways of dealing with those issues, resource savvy ways, intelligent ways of providing schooling. And sometimes we don't always have to wait for a foreign aid government or foreign aid or NGO to come and provide solutions. Sometimes we can just pioneer solutions ourselves that are just, they might be the first in the world that hasn't been done anywhere else, but we should do them. We shouldn't wait to see or look at other models that exist elsewhere before we try to do something. You know, if it means video conferencing to provide education over a long period, over vast amounts of distance, then so be it. It could be a situation where people say the United States want to, they want to go and, you know, they have these courses or these trips where you can go and teach English for like 6 weeks or whatever, and you backpack. Some people might not have the money to do it, but they wanted to be able to do it online. I mean, they have something called Udemy now, which is like it's an online, I think it's an app or an online kind of application or website where you can gain any kind of skills you want. The people who actually have those skills, and you, for a particular fee, you come online and they just talk to you via video conferencing. And it's actually being very successful. But we're talking about applying something like that as a resource savvy way of getting around having to spend money or any kind of physical resources to still get the information passed on. I mean, it's just the way of the future that we just need to think about. But we have people in government who are very old-fashioned, no ideas, they have no vision, and unfortunately, they're the ones in charge and in power. So until they're pushed out, and until people start to take things into their own hands, matters into their own hands, we'll continue to remain in the same position. But the final thing I think I wanted to touch on was when you talked about this resource from the US and the lack of it or the need for it in Africa. So who should instigate this? Who should reach out, and how, in your mind?
Well, to me, on a practical level, I think that there are a lot of people who would like to participate if they could. I don't have a hard and fast answer about who should do it, but I do think that African American colleges can be a vital instrument in moving us forward. One is that because they're a part of Black communities, it is institutions where there are institutions where you have, you know, Black intellectuals with varying skills in various things that have access to other African American people outside of the walls of those particular universities, who in all levels of government as well as in skilled crafts. So if we could get the connection between some of these institutions and some of these colleges on the continent, just as institutions that are linking with one another to accomplish certain kinds of tasks, that probably would jumpstart other relationships. But that's a practical one that I can sort of think of. I did some writing on this in a book called Scattered Assets, which is a book that I had done as a solo author, in which there's a chapter in that talking about, Black colleges. There's also an article that was published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies called Black Colleges, Their Future Use and Survival in a White Country, that describes some of my views on how Black colleges can be a resource. There's also, if you want to look up a paper online, it's called HBCUs, a think tank resource for Africa, that was also published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies. So I think that Black colleges can offer a practical way of interconnecting, simply because they do have an infrastructure and an intelligentsia within it, and outreach to different circles of influence within African American communities that could be useful to interconnect, share technology, share insight with different African concerns, just for the purpose of interaction. Just even the interaction itself will lead to other forms of collaboration.
Indeed, and yes, it's quite a surprise that it's not happening wholesale, because I would have thought, what would be the purpose of all that intelligentsia in the United States with not wanting to have a master plan of a reconnection to Africa? Or do they also not believe in Africa and Pan-Africanism? I would have thought that would have been a kind of core underpinning of all those universities.
Well, actually, the way that most of the African American colleges got started, they got started after the ending of slavery in the United States in 1865. So in between 1865 and the very, very early 1900s is when these colleges got started. Some of them were supported by state dollars, and then some of them were private institutions. Actually, 60 or 70 years ago, there were actually more historically Black colleges than there are now. Maybe 70 years ago, there was maybe about 120. Now we're down to about 105, given financial difficulties that have resulted in the closing of some of those schools. But let me just hit a brief history of that. When the Black colleges were started, the whole idea was that Black people would be in the United States, but they would be segregated under Jim Crow apartheid type system, so that everything would be completely separate. So the idea would be that these colleges would be responsible for training Black people to operate their own affairs in some limited form within the confines of the United States overall. So generally, the colleges were created in two tracks. One was a liberal arts focus, of which the original idea was basically preaching and teaching. That was a major focus early on. And then the other colleges were primarily agricultural and mechanical arts. So these colleges concentrated on so-called skills of the hand at that time, whether it be making bricks, farming, creating tools, anything of the hand to create an industrial base within Black circles. Okay, and so these were the so-called dual mission, a dual thrust of mission for these colleges. And as they continued to grow and blossom, they became intricately a part of the African American community that were responsible for producing a lot of the intelligentsia that we have in the United States. After segregation was over, then people began to think as to whether or not these colleges were still needed in the same way, because most people thought that these colleges were primarily needed in an era of Jim Crow in which things are segregated. But now that there's integration and people have choices for all different kinds of colleges, then some people who are Black who are wondering as to where these colleges would fit in to an integrated society. So I think that they do fit in, but I think that they are actually more needed for an outreach of a resource to Africa, along with training our people here. And if we could get that participatory interaction going, I think that there would be better uses, expanded uses, and even more economic rewards for the African American colleges in the United States today. Sometimes today they form surplus, meaning that these colleges don't get the kinds of monies in some ways that they need, though they survive despite all odds, even though some are private and some are state supported, with some colleges doing better financially than others. But nevertheless, in a pluralistic society in the United States, then there's competition for dollars and resources. I think one of the niches that the African American colleges can serve is to be a resource for Africa's economies in exchange for the revenue from some of these interactions to be given back to these schools. For example, suppose that in the example that I mentioned about Zimbabwe, suppose you were to take a cluster of African American colleges that concentrate on agriculture and technology. Let me just name two, for example. We've got more agriculture and technical colleges than these, but let me name two. Suppose that you have Florida A&M University and you have North Carolina Agricultural and Technical University, which happens to be my alma mater, working with the government of Zimbabwe regarding innovations when it comes to agriculture, or efficiency when it comes to agricultural economics, all kinds of things dealing with industrialization, logistics, agricultural productivity. Okay, suppose that these schools could help in the retraining of some of the farmers, could help with some of the industrialization needs in Zimbabwe, not only based upon the vacancy of the white farmers there, of not having the farms anymore, but also just for the country itself. As the country grew and its economic productivity increased, perhaps revenues from that economic increase could be put back into an investment into the Black colleges that I mentioned. So there's a win-win situation for helping with the productivity of African countries to benefit the economic empowerment of the Black colleges in the United States, who do not get as much monies pumped into them as they should. And I think that Africa as an outlet would be a new resource, economic resource on top of that, for these colleges to continue to grow as an additional niche to the servicing of primarily African American students in the United States, though actually many of them service, all peoples in the United States, but a particular niche, I think, should be in its development of Africa with economic resources coming back as a reciprocal benefit.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. I wonder why it hasn't occurred to this point. It's almost like a wasted resource, or a heavily underutilized resource. What comes to mind is, as well, I think you shared this with me, a university in Ghent that's doing research on BaNtu.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking something like that could be, prime or channeled through one of the universities in the United States, for who it would be more pertinent in a kind of Department of Linguistics, wherever that might be in any of those universities. It could have been channeled there over time in trying to discover their origins as well as those in Africa, and trying to forge this kind of unified language and bond and educational curriculum to teach the children as well in Africa and their own. It just seems that again, and this would be funded by Africans in time, so it'd be a win-win.
Even if most of these Black colleges were to offer a few courses in Swahili or Kimi Jakenda, we want to be forward-thinking in terms of the campaign to change the name recognition of the language to be more BaNtu affiliated in that sense. But nevertheless, they were to offer courses even in Swahili. Just that type of thrust would get people thinking in a more Pan-African way on all sides of the ocean. So we need African-American history being taught in colleges and schools on the African continent. I'm talking about specifically in terms of the African American diaspora being a great resource. I also believe that African people who live in Canada are also diverse and also are a great resource. And I believe that African people who are living in the EU are also a resource, along with the various African countries, Afro-Caribbean countries. But I particularly picked those resources of the UK and US and EU of African peoples there as really strong resources that can be harnessed right now in terms of interconnection with the continent. And I think that to have the histories of the African peoples, particularly in the United States, being taught effectively and correctly in different African universities and schools will go a long way in terms of the interaction, interconnection. For African American people taking Swahili and other African peoples who do not speak Swahili right now, but taking that builds the interaction. It's not that everybody's going to speak the language immediately or fluently. That's not the real point. The point is to get people into a mindset of cooperation, African thinking. And that's what the language does, because the language is designed to build a bridge where people begin to see themselves and other people who are the same as them, but in a different time, in a different core reality.
And that is exactly what Uwenzi is. So on that note, I think it'd be nice to end there. Thank you very much, Baruti Katembo. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been very incisive and insightful, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the viewers have as well. And,
yes, I've enjoyed it too. Maybe we need to develop for the future a BaNtu conference. Maybe we need a BaNtu conference, and maybe our conversation this evening might lend itself eventually toward crystallizing something like that. So I want to be a resource to you and your work, however I can be of help. And I hope this won't be, of course, the last time that we're interacting, but I've enjoyed the opportunity this evening to share some ideas and also to learn some additional things from you. And I've appreciated the opportunity for dialogue and intellectual exchange.
Well, absolutely. No, I don't intend for this to be the last time we definitely interact. And a conference, I'm all for that. I definitely would be happy to be involved and also to expand upon the framework that currently have in the vision. And yeah, please let me know other people that you might have who would be interested in this vision, and I'll also try and get them together, and then we'll figure out a way of either having a venue where we do it, or we do it online and we just brainstorm and come up with firm, solid ideas that we can put in some kind of white paper to whichever arm of the African Union that's responsible, and then float it and see where it goes.
Okay, thank you. I'll get busy on coming up with a few names of a few people that I think would be interested, and then I'll float their email addresses to you, and we can kind of start from there. But I know you and I will be talking, off script, from the show.
Absolutely. Okay, and for those of you to go out and buy the book, it's called Uwenzi. It's a very interesting book, a very good read, and I urge you to go and buy it as well. And yeah, thank you for watching, and thank you again, Baruti. I'm sure we'll speak again sometime soon.
Okay.
Jambo.
Yes, okay, and goodbye, Swahili, Tutawanana to you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Mm-hmm.